If they did that, they could shut down the corporation because they were going to put list pendants on all of Fisher's properties so that they couldn't sell their homes. That was what they said they were going to do. The plea offer was, instead, we'll take all that off the table. We'll have this corporation plead guilty to a felony. We'll have you pay $1 million fine, which he had absolutely no justification in the law for the immigration case that they brought. And by the way, we'll dismiss these charges against your 4 superintendents. We'll let them go free. That was the deal that was offered to us and the deal that we could not refuse. Now, most companies in most situations who do not have the financial ability and just the integrity would probably have taken that deal. And, you know, many people advised Mr. Fisher to take that deal. He did not, and that's why we're standing here today. The end result of the story was that for the next 4 months, no plea deals were accepted. Pressure continued to be placed on the individuals, and in fact, they indicted 2 more Fisher superintendents in August, trying to get them to give evidence against Fischer Homes. None of that took place. The charges were eventually dismissed against the Fisher superintendents. No case was ever brought against Fischer Homes. So that is just kind of my take on the plea bargaining system that we're in today, the immense power that it gives to the federal prosecutors. And we have 2 former assistant U.S. attorney and a U.S. attorney here. And kind of the question that I think we need to address and discuss today, as Henry said, you know, where is the accountability? If you have a case that once you bring it as a U.S. attorney, you do not find evidence of wrongdoing, why can't you just dismiss the charges right then and there? And the government had the information, the same information that they had in November when they dismissed these charges. If they tried to get a plea, they had on May 9th of 2006 when they took the records from Fischer Homes and knew that there was nothing to the criminal charges that they were bringing. So that's the discussion that I hope we can have here today, one of accountability. And again, I would thank the Buckeye Institute as well for giving us the opportunity to present this here today.
Thank you, David. Now on to our panelists. If I could, we have first on my right, Doesn't Wrong Guys Get Away With It? How did all this happen? How does it happen again and again? Or even in some other settings, whether it's not business crime or white-collar crime, but how could the parole board have let somebody off? Or how did a judge go lenient on that sentencing? And you know, whether it's the Bill O'Reillys or just the usual crime beat that we follow, it's dangerously easy to come away from stories and be frustrated and aggravated by crime that goes unaddressed or by what seem to be government failures for under-prosecuting. But what the Fischer Homes story, I think, documents, and what John does such a lovely job of highlighting in the book, is in fact there is a distinctive problem, and one that is oppressive in a different way and has different kinds of victims, but victims nonetheless, that comes from over-prosecution. And particularly, and this emphasizes some of the themes you've already heard about, the way politics plays a role in not only enabling, but encouraging over-prosecution. A point I made this morning, a point I want to emphasize again is, though one can't help but read this book that John put together and say, wow, it's the government, you know, run amok, and what a failed, disastrous case, it's still possible for prosecutors, or even those who think it's important for corporate entities to be extra tough on illegal immigrants or extra careful about who they hire, to look at this as a success story, remarkably. A success in terms of public imagery about deterrence, about the toughness of the Bush administration to crack down on illegal immigration. Unfortunate that perhaps an innocent person, and I would bet, and this is the saddest part that we see in a lot of settings, prosecutors who will resist, even when there's an acquittal, even when there is an exoneration, really admitting that an innocent person was caught up. And I can just give you another kind of example in another setting, this one that when I tell my students, they still can't believe it's the law, but it remains the law. If you're prosecuted for multiple charges, and this happens a fair amount in white-collar cases particularly because federal criminal law is written so broadly, oftentimes there's multiple charges involved, you can be convicted of only one charge and acquitted on all the others, and yet under existing sentencing law, a judge is entitled to, and often prosecutors will encourage the judge to decide on his or her own whether they really thought the person did the conduct that led to the acquittal, and to sentence, assuming the person is guilty of that which they've been acquitted. I actually had a client, the former mayor of Atlanta, who called me up because I had been writing about the injustice of what we call acquitted conduct sentencing. He had been prosecuted for corruption and had been tried in a highly public trial, very prominent, obviously, former mayor of Atlanta, got acquitted of all the corruption charges, but in some sense had admitted tax evasion as part of his defense to the corruption charges, got convicted on those lesser counts, but then at sentencing the judge said, I think you are corrupt, and I'm still going to increase your sentence because I think you ran a corrupt administration. That is just another kind of doctrine that exists that, as this book highlights, as I think the others will talk about as well, though we have this impression that the entire system is tilted in favor of the defense, the reality is, and again, Mr. Fischer lived this sadly in the worst possible way for quite some period of time, the system has come to operate to be quite tilted in favor of the prosecution. And that's why a number of people will plead guilty, maybe to things they're not guilty of, or at the very least, to things they're not as guilty of, in part because, and I can tell you other stories about this too in other settings, they learn and get good advice from good defense attorneys that say, even if you are innocent, the trial penalty you'll face, how much more harshly you'll be punished if you go to trial, and this is what I argued in front of the 11th Circuit in Mayor Campbell's case. He went to trial, won at trial, and still was punished more harshly than if he had accepted a plea deal. He was ultimately exonerated in the public for the corruption charges because of the acquittal, but he ended up serving 30 months in prison, whereas the prosecutors had offered him a deal of 18 months if he were willing to admit his corruption and rat out everybody else that was involved. And so the system ends up operating in a way that in many respects makes it entirely rational for the Henry Fischers of the world to cut their losses rather than take the chance of trying to assert their innocence, and even if they're vindicated, still suffering the harms and not getting anything more than perhaps some psychic satisfaction. And I get to compliment Mr. Fischer for not just taking that psychic satisfaction, but then bringing it to the world so that we can all see this important lesson of the other side of the pendulum. Again, the problem is not just occasionally government prosecutors taking their oath a little bit too seriously or being a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too attentive to both politics and the prosecutorial structure, but even more consequentially, that we built a set of rules that give the entire system a reason to become a plea bargaining machine. It's not a bunch of people acting irrationally. It's a bunch of people acting rationally within a legal system that justifiably wants to give the government every chance to catch the bad guys. But ultimately, the process of that often can be that a number of good people get caught up in the mix, and the transparency and accountability that I think will help minimize the risk that there are abuses in the system is what this forum, I think, is a fantastic opportunity to bring forward, because I think that issue, people knowing what's going on, but then also thinking about ways to build more accountability into the system so that the prosecutors don't go away and say, well, that one didn't quite work out, but we still got an awful lot of bang for our buck. Thank you. Michael?